Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Do you have $1,000? Do you want an epic, awesome RGB gaming computer build that will play all current games with great performance? You've come to the right place. This is the $1,000 Ryzen 5 2600 computer build video series sponsored by Gigabyte. Big shout out and thank you to Gigabyte for sending me all this wonderful stuff. I am looking forward to putting this together because there are some really cool parts in here. Now later in this video, I'm going to be talking about the individual parts, what benefits they bring. I'll unbox a few things because things like the RGB RAM won't get separate unboxing videos, but I'll show them later in the build itself. And then we're going to talk about what kind of performance you can expect and what kind of future upgradability this system allows. I am very excited about this build. Before we get into a detailed look at the individual parts, let me talk about the performance of this build in sort of broad strokes. 1080p, high detail or better, 60 frames per second or better, every game on the market, without exception. This computer will play everything out there on the market at the end of 2018 with no issues. Many games will play at very high or ultra detail. Many games will play well over 60 frames per second. In fact, many AAA games will do 100 plus frames per second 1080p high on that RX 588 gigabyte graphics card. Many games will also play very well at 1440p resolution, and benchmarks in the benchmark video, which won't be in this video, but the benchmarks will show you 1080p, 1440p, and even some 4K benchmarks, which that card does surprisingly well. It's roughly the same graphics performance that's in an Xbox One X, which is a 4K gaming console. No, you can't run Ultramax high details on every game at 4K, but you might be surprised, so watch for that video coming soon. In terms of non-gaming performance, content creation, 4K 60 frame per second video editing, this will do it very, very well. 3D animation, multitasking, virtual machines, this will also do it very well. It's a very well-rounded build in terms of performance of the CPU, performance of the graphics card, RAM, the SSD, etc. Now you can build this for less than $1,000 if you drop all of the RGB. Gigabyte makes lower-end B450 boards, you can certainly buy non-RGB RAM, and so on and so forth. But for a little bit extra money, you get a really, really nice looking system that will basically light your room up for you. Now, I haven't mentioned it, but behind me is the Cooler Master H500 case that has two large RGB cooling fans included with it. And then we also have the MA620P 6 heat pipe direct contact RGB cooler with dual RGB fans. Yes, there's a lot of RGB in here. Now, the Ryzen 5 2600 comes with a cooler. It's the Wraith Stealth. It's the small baby cooler. That thing is monstrously better. 3.7 gigahertz out of the box. We're going to overclock this to at least 4 gigahertz. Maybe we'll get 4.2. We'll show that to you in the separate benchmark overclocking video. But the general point that I want to make is that for most people, this represents the sweet spot of price to performance. You can buy more, Ryzen 7 exists. You can buy less, Ryzen 3 exists. But for a 3 to 5 year ownership time frame, if you're looking at building or buying a computer that will last you 3 to 5 years, for most average desktop users playing games, doing multitasking, doing content creation, you want something you can grow with, 6 cores, 12 threads, RX 580, maybe a graphics card halfway through the lifespan, maybe in 3 years, but otherwise, this provides you with everything you need for years to come. Now, a detailed analysis of the pros and cons of various parts is for another video, but what I will do is talk to you about what the parts in this video give you. Linked in the video description below will be the links to all of the parts that you see here and everything that I'm putting into this build. There's links to both Amazon and Newegg down there. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. If you find my channel, my build series, my Y vlogs, if you find them all to be helpful and useful, please use those when shopping. It really does make a difference. Now let's start off with the Ryzen 5 2600. On the day of filming, it's going for about $165 on Amazon. 6 cores, 12 threads. It has an all-core default boost of 3.7 gigahertz, but it will boost higher than that if you're using less of the cores, and it will do that on the included cooler. It's not going to run 4 to 4.2 gigahertz overclocked on the included cooler, which is why that cooler is included, because we're going to do that later. But if you don't want to overclock, if you don't want to mess around with it, then it's very, very good on the included stock cooler. Now, do most current games need 6 cores, 12 threads? No. A few do. Battlefield 1 multiplayer, the upcoming Call of Duty, Black Ops 4, for example, will use the 6 cores, 12 threads of this, but most games don't. They'll run just fine on 4 cores, 8 threads. Many games will run fine on 4 cores, 4 threads, honestly, but it's changing. The industry is moving in that direction. The next generation game consoles are going to have 8 cores, 16 threads. The current ones have 8 cores, 8 threads as it stands. So this gives you some future proofing to grow into games over the next few years and not have to change your CPU in the next 5 minutes, which is kind of nice. Now you need a motherboard to install your new CPU in. The Gigabyte AORUS B450 Pro Wi-Fi is a premium B450 board. It's about $120, but it has a lot of features most B450 boards don't have. Now it's going to get its own separate unboxing and review, but let me just say this. Intel Gigabit Ethernet, Intel AC Wi-Fi. Yes, I get it, irony, AMD build Intel, but Intel makes the best Wi-Fi and the best Gigabit Ethernet on the market, so for gaming and performance and low latency, those are the best choices. It has a Realtek ALC1220 with premium capacitors and premium components that is much better than the Realtek 7 or 800 series that you're going to find on cheap B450 boards. It has 2 M.2 slots with dual thermal protection for those. It has a better power delivery solution than most B450s have. Most B450s have fairly cheap VRMs, fairly cheap capacitors. This has a full suite of them. It's much closer to what an X470 board is going to have in terms of power delivery. RGB, well, this is an RGB build. It's got tons and tons of RGB. It has more USB ports, more connectors, more expansion. So you are going to pay $20 to $40 more for that board, but it's got a lot more features than the $60 to $80 boards have for not a lot of extra money. If we're playing games, we need a graphics card. Actually, the Ryzen 5 2600 has to have a graphics card because it comes with no integrated graphics. If you're not playing a lot of games, you could replace this with a Ryzen 5 2400G, which has Vega 11 graphics built in. Very nice. I've reviewed that. I've done benchmarks on that on my channel. But if you're going to put a graphics card in, get a Ryzen 5 2600. The AMD RX 580 currently represents the best value at the $250 price point. 8 gigabytes of VRAM gives you plenty of VRAM for the future. Most games don't currently need more than 4 gigs of VRAM, but that will change over the next 3 years. If you're buying a graphics card for the next couple of years, get an 8 gigabyte card. It does have enough performance to play all current games at 1080p, most current games at 1440p, and a surprising number of games at 4K. As I mentioned, I will be doing benchmarks at all 3 resolutions in future videos on this build. I think you might be surprised. And you can always crossfire those. Now, I generally prefer buying a single higher-end graphics card as opposed to running crossfire, but if you want to buy one card now and get a second card later, it certainly is an option. And crossfire is supported on the B450 board, whereas SLI is not. System RAM. If you are building a system with a $1,000 budget and a Ryzen 5 2600 or higher CPU, 16 gigs is the minimum to go with. 8 gigabytes is no longer an option for this level system at this point. If you're building a $500 or $600 system, sure. But at $1,000, 16 gigs of RAM. Now this is some gorgeous RGB RAM. I'm going to take this out of the box later in the video. I'm going to take several of these out of the box, but this has 2 extra dummy modules with RGB on them. It is 2 memory sticks, 8 gigabytes each, but there are 4 sticks in here total. It's a little bit more expensive, but that's pretty cool because all 4 memory slots can be populated and you get the RGB in all 4. If you're going for a system with a little bit of style, a little bit of bling, lots of RGB, that's pretty cool because you don't have to buy a 4-stick memory kit just to populate all the boards. And then if you buy another one of these in the future, you can just take out the 2 dummy modules, put in the other 2, and you'll have 32 gigs of RAM. It is DDR4 3200, which is the highest speed I would recommend for Ryzen. It technically supports higher, but price point value for the money, that's where you want to be. You can go slower, but you don't save that much these days. If I was building a new $1,000 system, 3200 is where I'd be at. Storage. We need a storage drive and a boot drive for our system. The Gigabyte UD Pro 512 gig solid state drive. I've previously done a separate review video on this drive on my channel. Great drive. That other drive that I previously reviewed is already on one of my test benches. This is going to be in and stay in this machine. Great performance from a serial ATA drive, which at the $1,000 price point is all you need. You don't need NVMe at this price point. You got to spend more than this before it's worth it. Now, that's not enough to install probably all of your game library, but it's enough to install several of your favorite games, and then you can just get a hard drive of your choice to install extra games on if you want to. But that's the smallest drive that I would consider. I would not buy the 256 gig drive at this size, at this price point. If you're building a $1,000 machine, 500 gigs. Now we need a power supply to power this beast. 750 watt, 80 plus gold modular power supply. The cables are disconnectable and you just put in the ones you need. That is a really nice power supply for under $100. That's pretty good. Now, why 750 watts? Well, you don't need 750 watts on this build. This whole system here is not even going to use half that. But you might want to add a second graphics card in the future, or you might want to upgrade to, say, a Vega 64, which will consume a lot more power, or maybe you'll want to upgrade the CPU to a Ryzen 7 in the future, perhaps a third or fourth gen down the line, because the AM4 socket, that B450 board, will support the next two generation of Ryzen chips. AMD has promised that for the next several years. So that gives you room to grow without having to worry about change out your power supply in the future. You don't have to. You could get a 550 watt power supply for $20, $30 less. But for a little bit extra now, you basically future-proof yourself to better graphics cards or better CPUs down the line. The Ryzen 5 2600 does come with a cooler in the box, and if you're not going to overclock, you can absolutely use the included cooler. The Wraith Stealth cooler that comes with it runs it just fine at 3.7 gigahertz. I have tested and verified that, but if you want to overclock, you're going to want to replace that cooler because it doesn't have a lot of headroom for overclocking. This beast will overclock the chip as far as it's going to go. You don't have to spend any more money than this. About $50 for a 6 heat pipe, not a 4, but a 6 heat pipe direct contact cooler with dual RGB fans is a pretty reasonable price, all things considered. Price out just the RGB fans, and it's a very good price for this cooler. Now, I've previously done a review on this cooler. That's on my channel. I've compared it to a 4 heat pipe cooler. It does a great job, and we will be doing overclocking later in this video series. For a system case, we're going with Cooler Master's H500 mid-tower thick computer case. It's wider than the average case, but it gives you plenty of room for large graphics cards, cooling, large tower coolers. This is an awesome case. Now, I have previously reviewed other 500 series cases from Cooler Master, and this will get its own review, but carrying handle on the top. More cases should have carrying handles. Two 200mm RGB fans in the front, space to mount another 200mm RGB fan on the top, and most importantly, 2 front panels are included. Both a clear acrylic front panel, if you just want the beautiful shiny front plastic look, or the mesh front is also included. You don't have to buy it separately. You don't have to order off for it and wait for it. You can choose if you want the mesh or the clear in the front. Combined with the carrying handle on top and the 200mm fans and a $99 price point, deal. I am very excited to be building in that case. Now, that is all of the parts that are included in the $1,000 budget for this build, but as you can see here, there are more parts on the desk than just those that I mentioned. I kept these separate because they're completely optional and they're items that you can either add or subtract to not only this build or any other build. Some of these will get their own review, some of them may not. We have a very nice RGB mouse pad right here, for example, and I know a lot of people are going to say, RGB mouse pad? Really? Why not? If you're going to buy an RGB keyboard and an RGB mouse, the mouse pad's not that much more, and as you can see from the box, it provides a nice RGB lighting ring around it. One of my goals in our new filming studio is to set this up in a room with the lights turned down and the camera settings set right, so we can get the keyboard, the mouse pad, and the system beautifully lit up and showcasing just how nice the RGB can work together when you use the software. Because the nice thing about having it all branded together is the software will control everything and we can make it all match. Now, as I said, these aren't included in the $1,000 price, but they don't add that much more. We've got a gaming headset that is $59. For a gaming headset, that's pretty reasonable, all things considered. We have a $59 RGB mouse, a $59 RGB mouse pad, and a $100 RGB mechanical Cherry MX keyboard. Now the keyboard comes in either blue switches or red switches. The blue switches are the really clicky ones that have a very tactile feedback to them. The red switches are a much softer feedback. If you like a very tactile typist feeling, get the blue. If you want something to use while you're live streaming, get the red because they're much quieter. And then finally, if you want to spend a bit less, we have a non-RGB mouse pad here if you don't need that much RGB on your desk. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that this is a sponsored build video series. Again, thank you, Gigabyte. I appreciate it. I have that wonderful new filming studio to pay for, so it definitely does help. But that does not mean that this is not a system that I would suggest building. There's a lot of personal preference in here. RGB RAM versus no RGB RAM is certainly a preference. You can certainly spend less money on that if you don't care about RGB. You don't need that much power supply if, for example, you're never going to crossfire, you're never going to upgrade to a Vega 64. Although I'd like to point out Gigabyte does sell 550 watt non-modular power supplies for like $30 or $40 less, so you can still buy a Gigabyte if you want to. But just because this is sponsored does not mean it's not a real review, and I won't give you true pros and cons, because I will. When Gigabyte sent me all this stuff and made arrangements to do this video, they did not, and I want to be very clear on this point, they did not provide me with any guidance whatsoever on how to build it, what to say. There was no talking points. I did not get even a list of things they wanted covered or not covered. The only requirement was that it be all AMD, of course, because AMD graphics card, AMD CPU, AMD motherboard, and that it have these Gigabyte products in it that they sent for the video. Beyond that, it's mine to make however I want. And just to make the point that that is absolutely true, that Ryzen 5 2600 CPU is not actually what came with the review kit. This is. They actually sent me a Ryzen 5 2400G. Now this is an awesome deal, and I have reviewed this, and there are a ton of benchmarks on my channel on this chip. Vega 11 graphics, 4 cores, 8 threads, up to 3.9 gigahertz, $160. It is an amazing value for the money. I love this chip, but not in this build. And when I opened it all up and inspected it, I fired off an email to them and said, wait a minute, guys, why'd you send this? And they said, well, because it's a great deal. And I said, well, yes, but an RX 580 is in here. It doesn't make any sense to buy a Ryzen 5 2400G, which includes Vega 11 graphics, when you're putting an RX 580 in the build, because it just disables the graphics. What's the point? For roughly the same price, or $5 more, you can get a Ryzen 5 2600 with 6 cores, 12 threads. No graphics, but who cares? We're putting an RX 580 in there. They said, sure, fine, whatever. So long as it's a Ryzen chip, we don't care. So this is an example of how I made a change to this build because I'm only going to do something that I would actually recommend. And I would never recommend that somebody do a Ryzen 5 2400G and a graphics card at the same time. That makes no sense. Where this chip does make sense is if you were not buying a graphics card right now. Maybe you play only casual games or esports games and you go, you know what, I'm going to wait until Navi comes out in 2019 and buy the next generation of card. I'm going to go without a graphics card. Fair enough. Well, the Ryzen 5 2600 doesn't work because it has no integrated graphics. This has very good graphics. I've done those benchmarks. You can see them on my channel. They're a compromise. You're not going to play everything in ultra-max detail, but it does work. And you could go with this for a year, then buy a graphics card and or another CPU. But if you are building a system today and you're putting a graphics card in on day one, skip the 2400G and go to a 2600. That's just an example of one of the changes that I made to this build because it didn't make any sense. So just because it's sponsored doesn't mean I'm not going to tell you what I really think. I mentioned the RAM. The RAM is a really good example. Now this is cool. This is the first RAM kit that I've ever covered that includes the 2 dummy modules so you get RGB across the entire RAM slots. More beauty. That's pretty cool. It's $220, or at least when I film this video. You can get 16 gigs of DDR4 3200 for $50 less than this. Do you want RGB or not? If you do, and you want all 4 memory slots filled, that's the price of admission. I'm going to show some beauty shots of this after the build gets done, and ultimately it's up to you. Do you want to spend an extra $50 to get that sweet, sweet RGB, or do you just want plain old boring black or red or whatever memory sticks? That's a personal choice. But I'm not going to sit here and say this makes your system faster than non-RGB RAM. That would be crazy. Likewise, the motherboard. I mentioned the motherboard features earlier. You can absolutely buy a B450 board for half the price of that. $60 will buy you a board that will have the same out-of-the-box performance as this one. But it won't have an Intel Gigabit LAN. It won't have Intel AC Wi-Fi. It may not have the dual M.2 slots for NVMe or SATA drives. It's not going to have the Realtek ALC 1220 high-quality 120 plus signal-to-noise ratio with the added capacitors. It's not going to have the RGB. It's not going to have the better power delivery. This really is actually not a bad deal. It really isn't. Even if you don't care about the RGB, those extra features will not, you're not going to find any of those on a $60 or even $80 motherboard. You got to spend at least $100 to get them. So that's not a bad choice. Graphics card, $250, RX 580, 8GB. I've been tweeting about those deals for weeks now. Ever since the end of the cryptocurrency mining problems have ended and the card prices have come down, that is now less expensive than a 6GB GTX 1060. And it's a better deal because it's basically the same performance. So when it comes to sponsored videos, and I'm including all of this because I've never done one of these before, and so I want you, my audience, my true audience, because after all, if you don't watch my videos, I don't have much of a YouTube channel. I want you to know that just because I'm being paid to do a video doesn't mean I'm going to compromise my integrity, and I'm going to tell you what I really think. Yes, $60 for an RGB mouse pad is expensive. People spend that much on iPhone cases. Take your pick. But if you want your entire desk area to be, shall we say, very shiny, then the mouse pad plus keyboard plus the mouse plus the system itself, sure, why not? For those of you curious, it adds about $300, $350 to add all the extra parts to this build. It's about $1,000 for the build, but $100 for the keyboard, $60 if you want the headset, $60 for that, so on and so forth. It does add a little bit to it, but it makes it shiny. One side note, the two Cooler Master products back there, that's not part of the sponsored nature of this video, although those were sent to me as review samples from Cooler Master. I'm using them because they're RGB and they go with the theme of this build. If you're gonna go RGB, go all the way in my opinion. I mean, you can do spot and little bits here and there, but I mean, let's be honest. The case, the cooler, the RAM, the motherboard, the graphics card, the mouse pad, the keyboard, the mouse, it's gonna be Christmas on your desk. So that's why I chose those. Furthermore, a $100 case with this level of components and a $1,000 build is the right price point. They make an H500M for $200. That's too much for a $1,000 machine. An H500M deserves a $1,500 to $2,000 build, in my opinion. Likewise, I've got a 240 or a 360 millimeter RGB cooler from Cooler Master. Too much for this build. Those belong on a $1,500 to $2,000 machine, for example. So a $50 cooler, a $100 case. I actually think this build is fairly well balanced for a combination of performance, value, longevity, and a little bit of RGB bling. You could knock a couple $100 off if you got rid of all that. A Masterbox 5, for example, cost you about $60. You certainly could get a Hyper 612 6-heat pipe cooler for about $20 less than that. And you can take a little bit off of everything if you don't want the RGB. But it sure is pretty, isn't it? Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below and hit that bell notification icon next to it. That's the only way to really get notified of new videos because YouTube doesn't notify anymore unless you hit that button. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, random ideas, suggestions, input? That's what the comment section is for. And then finally, as I mentioned before, links to everything you see here to Amazon and Newegg will be down in the video description. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. With the new filming studio space, I certainly could use it. I would certainly appreciate it if you use those when shopping. Now, as far as the rest of this video series go, part 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know yet exactly how many I'm going to make, but I will tell you there will be overclocking, there will be game performance benchmarks, there will be non-game benchmarks, there will be some kind of build video. I don't know if I'm going to do a full detailed build video on the computer itself. The new filming studio is not set up yet, and I don't really have a space to film it properly. We'll see. There will be RGB beauty shots. Of that you can be sure, because with all this stuff it'd be a shame not to. So at some point there will be that added as well. In any case, thank you all so much for watching and for being longtime Tech Deals fans. I will see you guys in the next video.